You're co-author of a February 2018 report, The Malicious Use of Artificial Intelligence, Forecasting, Prevention, and Mitigation. You say this: artificial intelligence is a game changer. And this report has imagined what the world could look like in the next 5 to 10 years. And you note this: our report is a call to action for governments, institutions, and individuals across the globe. What's been the reaction from governments, corporations, and individuals?
The reaction has actually been very positive. We were very pleased. We had an initial concern that we would put out this report and people would be concerned that maybe it's scaremongering or unnecessary concern. That was very much not our intention with the report. The idea was all of the authors on the report, many of whom are involved in artificial intelligence development themselves, some of whom are within industry, were motivated to develop this report so that we could identify and mitigate potential negative uses in order to be able to achieve the positive uses that we're all excited about. One of the main recommendations that we were trying to bring across in the report is that with artificial intelligence developing quite quickly, and in particular artificial intelligence being applied to so many different safety critical systems in our world, this means that we need to start working together more closely between machine learning experts who really understand the state of the art of the technology, policymakers and lawyers who need to legislate around it and who need to guide governmental strategy around it, and the civil infrastructure people, the social scientists who need to think about the impacts of it. Now, within the broader ecosystem of work happening on these issues, we were particularly interested in what are the ways in which people might misuse or adapt benign advances in artificial intelligence to cause harm in various ways, and how can we stop that?
You've been involved with both the concept of existential risk and the development of artificial intelligence. According to one of your colleagues, Nick Bostrom, quote, "The transition to the machine intelligence era looks like a momentous event and one associated with significant existential risk." If that's true, what is the risk, and is it existential?
So the first thing that's important to note is that when Nick Bostrom talks about the transition to machine intelligence and existential risk, he's not speaking about the artificial intelligence systems that we have in the world today or tomorrow or even next year. He's looking forward to the advent of what we might term artificial general intelligence, the kind of general reasoning, problem-solving intelligence that allows us to dominate our environment in the way that the human species has. We are currently nowhere near that, and experts are divided on how long it will take us to achieve that, but it's very unlikely to be less than a decade, and it could be many decades according to some experts. However, were we to achieve this, it would undoubtedly change the world in more ways than we can imagine. Thinking about it broadly, it is our intelligence that has allowed us to change the world more than nearly any species that has come before us. We're not particularly impressive mammals for any other reason except our ability to understand our environment, to create tools, and to change it around us. If we were to create intelligence that was equivalent or perhaps even greater, then it would undoubtedly change the world even more. And it would be imprudent of us to assume that that would go very well for us. And in the extreme case, it might end up causing major harm to us. We have harmed our own environment more than any other species. We're wiping out species at a rate of knots. We're changing our climate in a way that might be unsustainable for our future. If we were to bring into this world intelligence that allow us either as our tools or as independent entities to change the world even more, we need to think very carefully about the kinds of goals that we give them and the level of autonomy that these future systems might have, because it may be very difficult for us to turn back the clock after we have put them into the world. However, this is not the AI that we have in the world today or tomorrow or next year. It's a longer term development, but I do think it's very worthwhile for people to be thinking about whether we are on that trajectory and what are the steps that we might want to take in advance.
What would a short summary of the history of artificial intelligence or machine learning look like?
One of the really pivotal moments was a conference held in Dartmouth in 1956, where some of the most brilliant thinkers in computer science and other fields got together and set themselves the task of trying to achieve the creation of machines that were able to think and reason like humans. Now, they were very optimistic, ambitious at the time. They thought that many of the challenges that have taken us the 60 years since then would be done over the course of a summer, over the course of a couple of years. So they thought machine vision, machine translation, a lot of these things would be hard but achievable with a small team over the course of a few months. Of course, we now know that it's taken us since then. But I would see that as the sort of formal beginning of the field of artificial intelligence. And that involved luminaries like John McCarthy and Claude Shannon and others.
How would you evaluate the progress we're making in AI? Are we proceeding as we might expect?
I think we're not making progress as we thought we would, but I think we are making progress. As in the case of many scientific fields, the challenge of creating artificial intelligence turned out to be much more difficult than it originally looked. And in hindsight, this is probably not surprising. Intelligence is one of the most complex things that exists, and it's what's allowed us to change our world in the myriad ways that we have. And the thought that we could recreate this or something equivalent within the course of a few months or a few years was perhaps a little bit optimistic. Over the course of the last 60 years or so, there have been bursts of progress followed by at least apparent slowing down. This has been described in a couple of occasions as AI summers and winters. And often what has happened is that a particular approach has borne initial fruit, whether it was symbolic reasoning and logic or expert systems, only to bring us a certain length of the way, but no further. At the moment, there has been a lot of progress, particularly over the course of the last decade, driven by an approach known as machine learning. And the thing that makes machine learning unique is that machine learning systems aren't hard programmed to follow through a specific set of steps. Instead, the idea is systems that are able to analyze data and either take an action or come to an answer without being specifically programmed for that task. And one of the reasons that there's been a lot of progress in that over the last decade in particular comes down to a couple of different factors. One is faster computers. The original theory for neural networks, for example, which are a prominent technique in machine learning, was developed decades ago, but these techniques turned out to be quite computationally expensive, and they only really started to work when computers became faster, as they have recently. Another factor has been the availability of a large amount of data. So some of the best techniques we have at the moment are able to operate very efficiently if we have millions of examples to draw on, but don't have the human ability to see 3 examples of a cat and to have an intuitive sense of what a cat is. And then I guess the third big thing is improvements in the algorithms themselves.
So a lot of people, when they hear about these things, probably get worried about the idea of deep learning. For the person on the street, he might think about losing a job as a result of artificial intelligence. Or if he's more informed, he might get worried that maybe a machine eventually would go rogue on us. Is that something we need to be concerned about?
Deep learning is a very interesting technology or set of approaches. It may prove to be a crucial component of the kind of long-term artificial intelligence that people like Bostrom and Russell talk about, but at its current state, it's not going to achieve a level of agency and intelligence equivalent to our own. However, it turns out to be useful in a range of different settings. One concern that has been raised is the concern that certain occupations might be automated, and I think that this is a valid concern and one that we need to be thinking about, because it is quite likely that certain occupations will turn out to be automated with techniques such as deep learning. It's a little unpredictable which ones so far, but a lot of work is being done on this. We don't know how many other forms of occupations will be created. Technology does create new jobs. The critical question will be, will there be enough new jobs to replace the old ones, and will the people who are out of a job in the previous generation be suited to the new jobs that are created? But there are a range of other issues long before we get to artificial general intelligence as well. There are questions like what is known as algorithmic bias. As we introduce AI systems into more and more decision-making processes, ranging from whether to approve your insurance loan, through to whether to allow you out for bail, through to trading stocks in the stock market, there is a concern that systems might reflect biases that exist in some of the data on which they're trained. One of the key things about these systems is, at least at present, they're very much trained by huge amounts of the data that we currently have. And if there are historical biases in that data, then they might be reflected, exacerbated, or locked in. So there's now a burgeoning field that combines computer science and also social science, economics, and policy, that's called fairness, accountability, and transparency in machine learning, sometimes abbreviated to FATML, where the concern is whether these new systems will be fair, whether they'll be accountable. In other words, will we be able to understand how they're coming to a decision and who is responsible at the end of the day, whether they'll be transparent, will we be able to follow the process of reasoning that is occurring when we're using AI systems. And these questions will only become more important as the systems become more powerful and more pervasive in many other walks of life.
So what are the main applications of AI that we need to be concerned about?
Digital, by which we mean, for example, cyber attack and cyber defense. Physical, so ways in which either physical attacks could be enabled by AI systems or physical infrastructure could be attacked. And political, so within that, advances in surveillance, automated propaganda, targeting, anything that might allow malicious actors to subvert political processes or to interfere with truthful discussion and debate. And we identified sort of three broad trends that cut across these areas. One trend was that artificial intelligence will allow an expansion of the sorts of threats that we currently face. Another is that it'll introduce new types of threats that we'll need new approaches in order to mitigate. And a third is that it will change the character of the kinds of threats that we face in a number of ways that we need to be mindful of. So to give an example of an expansion of a threat, if we consider cyber attack, right now there's a huge difference between the effectiveness of what is known as spear phishing versus phishing. Now, phishing with a PH in cyber security is when somebody sends out a malicious email to try to get you to click on a bad link or something. And if you get an email from a Nigerian prince offering you $50 million, you probably see that and you say, nah, and you just put it aside. Now, a spear phishing attack, by contrast, usually involves a human or a group of humans who will take a lot of time to learn to identify you as a high-value target, to learn everything they can about you, to figure out enough about you that they can then tailor a specific attack to you that will look convincing to you. It'll look like it'll come from somebody who you trust, or include enough personal information that you don't see it as a malicious attack. And those are much, much more effective, and even cyber security experts will fall for them. Now, one concern is that right now there's a limit to how many of these kinds of effective attacks can take place because it requires a lot of human expertise and time. If you're able to automate quite a bit of that process, then suddenly it becomes available to a lot more actors to carry out those attacks and a lot cheaper. So for example, you could have an automatic system that scans and identifies by various different flags you as a high value target, either because of the organization you're a part of or your wealth or patterns of your activity. You could then have a system gather an awful lot of information about you, your various social media profile, your activities, and then you could imagine automating various bits of the process that allows you to be fooled by the attack, whether it's by helping to craft a message that you're more likely to click on, inclusion of bits of information that make it feel like this is a relevant email to you, even the idea of synthesized voice or synthesized images. So we're getting to the point where speech synthesis could mean that somebody could turn a message that they record in their own voice into something that sounds like the voice of somebody you know, if they have enough samples of that person's voice. And so suddenly you have the toolbox to allow a more sophisticated attack that might be available to many more people than would have been able to do in the past. And the extreme example of something like this would be, like right now, only a very well-resourced group could do something like develop Stuxnet or the Ukraine power grid takedown. But again, if many aspects of what makes that a high expertise, high time, high resource attack can be automated, then perhaps we might see more of these kinds of attacks. An example of a new kind of threat. So artificial intelligence systems themselves, we're going to be introducing them in the world in various contexts. They themselves can be attacked in ways that are different from traditional computer systems. So one example is the idea of an adversarial attack, where if you feed the right kind of image or the right kind of pixels to a system, you can fool that system into thinking it's seeing something it's not seeing. So it's been shown that if you change just a couple of pixels on a stop sign that, for example, a self-driving vehicle sees, it reads it as a go sign. And you could imagine doing something like this at scale and, for example, causing quite a few crashes. Now, I think there'll be enough eyes on self-driving cars that this won't happen in that context. But if we're going to be introducing these systems into everything from healthcare to transport to civilian infrastructure, we need to think about the new ways in which these systems might be attacked. Another example might be in the physical domain. Right now, there is no way in which a human could operate a drone swarm, which is a swarm of small, for example, flying robots, which could be a very effective tool for attack. But artificial intelligence would allow the kind of coordination and communication between these drones that would allow potentially a very powerful attack using these. So that's an entirely new weapon that might become available to people in the next 5 to 10 years.
Your colleague Martin Rees has made the comment that existential risk, might be caused by rogue actors. And he puts it this way: the global village will have its village idiots. Are these the only individuals you're trying to impede?
I certainly think that we do need to be worried about the lone actors and the village idiots. And one of the concerning factors is that advances in both artificial intelligence and biotechnologies, and Martin has written about this a lot, might allow the lone wolf to do more sophisticated and more high consequence harms than they would have been able to do in the past. However, I think it would probably be naive to rule out more powerful non-state actors and even state actors as well. We've just seen over the last year that certain states have made attempts to interfere in the political processes of other states. We are not past the stage of seeing future large-scale conflicts and wars, and I think we need to be worried about that. And in a world in which the pressures that we face in terms of climate, resources, large-scale migration, food, water security, the food-water energy nexus, in fact, in a world where we're facing these pressures, I think we need to be worried about what well-resourced groups might do as well as the lone wolves.
What is the Russian election propaganda social media situation? Tell us about the human element in the misuse of AI. Personal data can be used for good, marketing, for example, and for bad, manipulation.
The Russian manipulation shows that there are a lot more ways in which we can be influenced than we necessarily realize, and it can happen at a greater scale than we necessarily realized. And it might give us a harbinger of what might be to come if we don't think carefully about these things. So, for example, I've read that Russian hackers sent something like 10,000 tailored tweets to members of the Department of Defense in the US and others. Now, right now, I imagine that meant a lot of people writing these tweets. But again, if we can automate some of these processes, then we might see even larger scale attempts to interfere in this way, or those tools becoming available to more people. I think that this means that we need to think carefully about how technologies will be used, because certainly the people who are developing all the techniques that underlie this kind of automation are not doing it in order to enable hacking of elections. They're doing it for all sorts of benign purposes, to reduce the drudgery of lots of things that we waste time on. What it really shows is the dual use potential of many technologies, that we can develop them with only beneficial purposes in mind, but we also do need to be mindful that people will find a way of taking these beneficial uses and repurposing them for their own purposes, some of which won't necessarily be benign.
At the end of the Second World War, Einstein wrote a famous editorial in the New York Times. He's obviously regretting that the nuclear genie is out of the bottle, and scientists sometimes get to this point. We recently did an interview with the CRISPR scientist Jennifer Doudna. During the interview, she seemed to be not too worried about where this was all leading. But when her book came out, she expressed a concern as to what might now be possible as a result. Where along the line does the scientist ask him or herself whether something should be said now before whatever they're working on becomes a big public issue?
Yes, this is a topic that we discuss very regularly with scientists in the field who have a variety of views on it. There's clearly a role and a responsibility for scientists to think about how their research, where their research might lead, and how it can be used in various ways. And often the scientists are the best people positioned to think about ways in which it could be used in different ways, although it can be very difficult to predict every single way. I mean, for example, if we decided to stop scientific progress because of all the ways it could potentially be misused, when we think about electricity, we would have developed electricity and thrown it away because there are so many myriad uses of electricity, but the net impact on humanity has undoubtedly been good. I think it's probably a mistake to put all of the responsibility on the scientific community. I think that there are roles as well for scientific funders, for publishers, for regulators and policymakers, at discussions at every level of this, but also at different points in the kind of development and deployment process. It's a very tricky one to know how to get right, and I think the best that we can do is to display a level of perhaps what we might call cautious responsibility, not to be afraid to engage outside of our discipline with people who are thinking about how this technology might impact the world, but at the same time not throwing away the benefits of the uses for which a lot of these technological developments are intended.
You mentioned dual-use technologies. Can you explain that a bit more?
I would define dual-use technologies as technologies that are developed for a beneficial or generally, benign civilian purpose, but that lend themselves to the possibility of being repurposed for a malicious intent. So an example might be research on understanding the influenza virus. We might make changes to the influenza virus to understand exactly how it mutates in the wild and thus help us develop better vaccines. On the other hand, there's the hypothetical concern that if we demonstrate how to make the virus more dangerous or more transmissible, somebody could take that and use it to create a biological attack. Similarly, in the case of artificial intelligence, many of the fundamental advances that allow many of the good things, whether it's tagging your friends in a photo, or a self-driving car finding its way around a city to allow an elderly person who can't drive without it to be able to get to their family's house. The same advances might potentially find application to battlefield robots, which we might consider a less positive use. I mean, it'll be what allows your battlefield robot to find its way around a battlefield with many obstacles, and perhaps to identify by facial recognition the target that it wants to take out. And as a result, there is a need to think about, even if our purpose in developing the technology is to help our communities in various benign ways, are there ways in which people will then take this and apply it in a very different context, which we may be less sanguine about?
The malicious use report that you produced notes that AI creates anonymity and psychological distance. What does this mean, and why is it of concern?
Well, there are two reasons in particular. One is the idea that when you have to harm somebody with a knife, you have to really get up close and personal with them. It's a very psychologically difficult thing to do. And perhaps this plays a role in making sure it doesn't happen so often. Similarly, if you have to see somebody face to face and fire a gun at them, that requires overcoming all sorts of barriers. On the other hand, if all you had to do was let a flying robot out and send it off to kill somebody who you'll never ever have to see face to face, perhaps that might make it easier psychologically to take on certain activities such as assassinating somebody, than would otherwise be the case. Another reason why it's potentially a problem is the problem of attribution. If we are to have safeguards in place, we need to be able to catch people, and we need to be able to assign blame to people who do bad things, whether it's a robot that explodes and harms somebody, or a cyber attack that takes down a power grid and indirectly causes deaths. If we put enough distance between the attacker and the target by, for example, having the system deployed and then acting autonomously, it may make it much harder to trace it back to the person who originally undertook the attack, which means that it'll be much harder to enforce rules around it.
Another concern in the malicious use report is political security. You say that surveillance and deception are especially problematic in authoritarian states. Even the truthfulness of public debates in democracies is in danger. How does AI empower propaganda?
There are a number of different ways, and I think that we will only keep discovering more. So one way is, if I want to influence you, it will be easier for me to influence you with my political message or political propaganda if I can tailor it to a certain extent to your personality profile, your hopes and your fears. We know this works quite well in marketing already. People have shown that by analyzing, for example, Facebook posts, they can come up with some sort of crude idea of whether somebody's more likely to be extroverted or introverted, anxious versus secure, and so on. And if you can show somebody the same ad for the same hotel with two different messages, for example, one for the extrovert showing a big party by the pool, one for the introvert or the anxious person showing them sitting by the pool with a book, taking some downtime, and the click-through rate goes up an awful lot. Now, you can also imagine taking the same approaches and applying them to political messaging. If you're somebody who is, particularly anxious, maybe the message is something about, hordes of immigrants coming over the borders, rather than if you're somebody very optimistic, maybe it's something about, this party will create lots of new jobs or something exciting. And what makes this bit different from the past is that rather than sending out a blanket message, there is a potential that a particular message could be chosen and crafted for a subsection of the population that roughly fits your profile that is more likely to influence you. Now, in some ways, this is an evolution from normal advertising, but on the other hand, one concern is that if this in some ways kind of subverts our sort of conscious decision making, then it might be quite concerning. There are more sort of direct concerns as well, such as techniques are being developed using artificial intelligence that allow us to very convincingly create fake images, fake video, fake audio, and so that might make it possible to create a fake video of a political leader saying something that you find completely abhorrent. And if we flood information channels with these fake videos, it may become much more difficult to tell what's true and what's not. Now, there are bodies of work going on to try and do automatic identification of fake video and different ways of certifying real versus fake, but a lot matters on can you actually get the refutation out in time. So those are the causes of some considerable concern.
What does it mean to have one's identity stolen in the modern AI world?
That's a good question. So we've been familiar in the past with the idea of credit card fraud and bank fraud. In a world in which we can create a voice file of you saying something that I scripted, or you appearing to say something that I scripted for some purpose, I think that we could see a much more sophisticated level of stolen identity. And given that we're seeing this environment of, fake news and people refuting things that they actually did say, it's going to get harder and harder to know what is real and what is fake. And I think that might be a cause for some concern.
So what should the person on the street be worried about when it comes to AI?
The first thing I would say is that the man in the street should also be optimistic about all the various ways in which AI will help him or her, the woman in the street, because on balance I still think that the benefits will considerably outweigh the possible harms. I think the person on the street should be thinking about what job they do, what are the skills involved in that job, and whether it's likely that those skills can be automated on a 10 or 20 year time horizon. Moreover, they should be thinking about what kind of education their children are getting and whether that education enables the sort of flexible, creative, problem-solving abilities that will be crucial in the world in which we enter, in which new jobs are opening up, but a lot of the traditional sectors of employment are going away. The person on the street should also be very mindful of their online security, because the nature of the kinds of attacks that they might encounter will go from the crude and easily spotted to the more sophisticated and easy to fall for. The person on the street should also be mindful of the ways in which technology is enabling far more gathering of information about them and potentially far more influencing of their actions, whether by commercial actors or by the state. And as a result, the person on the street should make sure to exercise his or her democratic rights and make sure that the rules and policies that are being enacted around these technologies are consistent with their values.
So what keeps machines from actually taking over? Let's suppose the machine shuts down the grid to protect its own integrity. Will human beings have the capacity to prevent things like that happening?
For the time being, yes. And by for the time being, I mean for the coming years and probably decades. I think in the near term, a concern that might be more pressing is that it may not be apparent to us that a machine is on a bad track until it's a little too late for us to intervene without harm. So a very early version of this might be something like the stock market crash, where you had misbehavior of algorithms, among other things, that cascaded, but everything was going so quickly that by the time humans were able to intervene, there was a significant, value wiped off the stock market. We do need to be very careful of these things as we introduce AI systems into more and more critical infrastructure, and it's essential that we at all times try to maintain a meaningful understanding of how these systems are coming to the decisions they are, what are the circumstances in which they'll work well, what are the circumstances in which they fail. We are not yet anywhere near the level of technology that would allow AI systems to display a lot of kind of creative problem solving in pursuit of their goals, including taking actions to avoid being shut down, other than in very simple game settings. And so this is a concern, I think, for the long-term research community in designing the systems of a decade from now and 2 decades from now. And I think it is work that needs to be done now, but it's not a concern that I think it needs to keep the average person awake at the moment, simply because we don't have that level of broad, flexible intelligence yet.
Is there any aspect of life in which AI makes us safer? Where are the threats decreasing?
I think that in nearly every aspect of life, there are ways in which artificial intelligence may make the world safer. So when we're in the process of developing self-driving cars, and there are still some technical and legal challenges to overcome, but there is no reason that mature self-driving car technology on our roads should be more dangerous than humans. In fact, I think it's most likely that self-driving cars, when a fully mature deployed technology, will cause considerably fewer crashes than human beings. They will not drive when drunk, they will not drive when tired, they will not get distracted by what the kids are doing in the back seat. Car crashes on our roads are one of the biggest causes of mortality in our world, so I think that will make the world safer. Another example is healthcare. So right now, many of the diseases that we face, early identification is key to avoiding a bad outcome. For example, with cancers, scanning tumor images and doing things like segmentation, a lot of the processes involved in cancer identification and treatment are very time consuming and require a consultant with decades of experience and training. Now, if we can automate a lot of those processes, then suddenly these treatments become available more cheaply and more quickly to more people, cutting down waiting times and saving many, many lives. I think that artificial intelligence will help us do more sophisticated climate modeling. It will allow us to make our energy grids more efficient, thus cutting down on our energy uses. Google applied some of their most advanced AI to their server farms just 2 years ago and cut the energy use for data cooling by 40%. Now that's the energy use of, I don't know, a small city or something. That's tremendously helpful. Artificial intelligence is also being applied to looking at disaster areas, so scanning through images to help tell responders where they need to prioritize to respond. We will in time have robots that are able to go into risky areas such as disaster areas where you don't want to risk a human life. Nearly every domain of human life, there is a way in which artificial intelligence can also make it safer.
I read recently about the possibility of delivering Ebola vaccine by drone. Kind of an interesting development.
Absolutely. And Microsoft, I believe, are trialing an idea to use drones to gather samples of things like mosquito to see what they're carrying in terms of disease spread. People are also using machine learning to predict where dengue fever outbreaks might occur by taking into account geography, spread of vectors that might carry the disease, humidity, lots and lots of different factors that are too much for any person to take all into account.
According to psychologist Kirk Schneider, high tech fulfills many needs, most of them physical, informational, and commercial. What it tends not to fulfill are existential needs, purpose, connection, awe for life. What's your reaction to that?
I think that this statement is true and not true at the same time, at least in my personal view. Technology is just technology. A lot of the trick is in how we use it. I don't think technology is ever going to replace the human touch and spending time with one's family or going down to the pub and meeting somebody. Anyone who's done a Skype meeting or sent an email knows that. On the other hand, if it automates some processes that make somebody's life easier and allows them to spend more time with their loved ones, then perhaps it makes it easier for that existential need to be met. I think even when you don't have that face-to-face connection, one of the things that technology does is it allows us to put a human being in our minds when we think of people in different parts of the world. So for me, many of my closer collaborators are people who are in the US or in India or in Australia, who in a previous lifetime would have been a fact in a book or a statistic to me. Now they're real people, and if a disaster were to befall India, they would be real people to me. So I think that technology, while it can distance us from each other and fail to address our human existential needs, can also enable it. It's all about how we use it.
Perhaps we could talk a little bit about the brain and the mind. Stephen Morse is professor of law and psychology at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. He said this in a 2005 neuroscience conference. We have no idea how the brain enables the mind. We know a lot about localization of function. We know a lot about neurophysiological processes. But how the brain produces mental states, how it produces conscious, rational intentionality, we don't have a clue. When we do, it will revolutionize the biological sciences. How do you view the human brain? Is it just another kind of machine for you? Is it different from mind?
If the brain is a machine, it's the most remarkable machine that exists in our world by a long shot, far beyond anything that we ourselves have created. I personally don't believe that there's something magical about us. I think that we evolved, and I think that in the same way that our bodies are in some ways machines to allow us to move around, our brain is the physical substrate which allows our minds to occur. I do believe that someday we will understand the human brain and how it creates the human mind, at least to a much greater extent than we do right now. I don't think that the human brain and the human mind are unknowable. However, we are a long way from developing that level of understanding right now. I think that many insights from understanding the brain will allow us to revolutionize biological science and also cognitive science, and will provide incredible insights into artificial intelligence. However, I don't think it is necessarily the case that we need to understand every aspect of the human brain and how it enables the human mind before we create really transformative levels of artificial intelligence. We know in the past that we have found various different ways to solve a problem. We gained insights from how birds fly in order to develop a plane, but a plane is in no way the same in terms of the mechanics as a bird flying. And I would argue that we were able to create manned air flight long before we had a deep and proper understanding of how even a bumblebee flies.
The program director for AI at the Alan Turing Institute recently said he didn't feel that he had to understand everything that went into an AI decision, just as long as it was reliable at something like the 95% level. Then he would be satisfied. Is that a view you share?
I'm not sure I share this. I think it's a valid viewpoint. So one view would be, let's say it's a medical diagnosis system. One viewpoint would say, well, if it's 99.9% accurate and the human expert is 99.2, then you don't need to understand the medical system because it's just better. On the other hand, I think there's a considerable value to knowing why that 0.1 exists for the AI system and what are the circumstances in which it's going to be wrong, because they may be different circumstances than the ones for which the human expert would be wrong. I think it is important that we understand what are the environments in which the AI system won't necessarily be accurate. And I think this will only become more important as we develop more capable systems that are in more and more of our processes, because if we simply don't understand, if we can't interrogate the reasoning that's happening here, we won't necessarily know the circumstances in which they're going to be wrong and why. When a human expert is wrong, we often have a pretty good reason why they might be wrong. Maybe they haven't been trained enough on the particular tasks they have to perform. Maybe they've been forced to work for 20 hours without a break. Maybe they've gone too long without a meal. I mean, we can come up with some reasons for why they might be wrong. I think things do become dangerous if we simply have absolutely no idea why something is right and why something is wrong, even if the overall accuracy is higher.
So that brings us to a connected question. One of the dangers inherent in the application of AI to decision making is that while it may be objective, it may not be as capable of fine discrimination as a human being would be, say in deciding whether a person should go to jail or not. Would AI be able to deliver a decision that demonstrated mercy?
There are a lot of challenges to applying AI in decision settings. I think they will find good uses, but I think that we do need to deploy them with appropriate care and consideration. One concern is that if we're using AI systems in settings like deciding whether to approve a loan or deciding whether somebody should go to jail, these systems will inevitably be trained on a lot of historical data that we give them. And if that data reflects the reality that we live in and that we want to live in, that's okay. But it is likely that that data might reflect historical biases in the data. So, for example, an article released last year talked about the application of artificial intelligence to predicting whether criminals released on parole might reoffend. And it turned out that it was much more likely to approve bail for people who were from a well-off background and who were a certain skin color. Now, a sophisticated human who was aware of these concerns of biases might recognize that, okay, we need to be mindful of these things, whereas the system might just be looking at what's been approved and what hasn't in the past. And the concern there is that if there are existing biases in the data, we might exacerbate those or lock them in a certain way, which might prevent us from moving to the more fair society in which we want to live. There's also concerns such as, so one concern is that if you train up an AI system on, for example, healthcare results in the UK, and it's pretty good at giving a good decision on people in the UK because that's where it's been trained, but then you take the system and you apply it somewhere else, let's say in India or Brazil, and suddenly your system, it's very good at recognizing whether a cancer is malignant or benign on a pasty UK skin tone, but it has a lot more difficulty against somebody with darker skin, and as a result gives more false positives or more false negatives. It basically gives people the wrong diagnoses. So in some ways this is a human error. It's us taking a system that is trained in one context and putting it into another. But as we bring AI into the world, into decision-making contexts, we need to be very mindful of these things. Are the environments in which we are putting the AI systems, are they the same as what we train them on? Is the data that we're providing them fair and balanced, or does it reflect historical biases that actually we don't want to see reflected in the decisions that the AI system makes? Now, humans are not perfect decision makers either. Humans are also biased, sometimes more so than others. One optimistic viewpoint is that perhaps with careful deployment, we might be able to get the best of both worlds, in that AI systems might help to uncover biases that we'd not really thought of before, and to also help us to overcome human irrationalities, such as bad human decision making when we're tired or when we haven't had lunch, or just human bias that we're unaware of but nonetheless display in our decisions.
So let me ask you if overall you're optimistic or pessimistic. Will we make it to the end of the 21st century?
I'm inherently an optimistic person, and I think you need to be if you're thinking about these things all day long, because otherwise it would be hard to come into work. I think there are legitimate things that we need to be concerned about, including nuclear weapons. The threat has never gone away. Biodiversity loss frightens the heck out of me. We are wiping out species at an unprecedented rate. I believe we're not taking the actions that we need fast enough on climate change, and we are certainly developing more powerful technologies that are available to more and more people. On the other hand, we are also helping to improve the lot of everyone on the planet. There are fewer people in absolute poverty than there have been in the past. We are extending the principles of human rights to more people than ever had these rights before. And we're learning to recognize our fellow human beings in every part of the world as people just like us, who have lives like us, and who have the same rights to a good life into the future that we do. And I think it's this shared global understanding that we need to develop, and that will allow us to live sustainably both on our planet and in the development of the very powerful technologies that we will be developing in the coming decades.
Thanks very much.